Hey guys, what's up? It's almost that time of year when I do my yearly update video on the most disturbing movies ever made. This year's video is going to be a top 20, but in the meantime, I figured I would do another one of my 5 overlooked, disturbing, and/or kind of just, anyway, top 5 kind of overlooked, underseen, or at least not mentioned that often among the disturbing movie and extreme cinema circles kind of movies. So essentially this is just going to be 5 movies in random order. I've done this kind of video twice already, and this is probably going to be the last one I'm going to do because I'm starting to run out of random obscure titles when it comes to movies that could be considered disturbing that aren't, you know, that aren't like the super well known, that aren't the Cannibal Holocausts or the August Undergrounds or the or the Goodbye Uncle Toms, for example. So this is gonna be like me mentioning just 5 kind of random horror exploitation titles that either I personally find to be disturbing or uncomfortable or unnerving or disgusting or what have you, or that I could see quite a lot of people saying this is a disturbing movie. That's kind of the criteria for the list. This is just a kind of random recommendation video. I will say all of the movies that I'm about to talk about are movies that I personally wouldn't say I enjoy all of them, but I do think they're all pretty interesting and pretty worthwhile titles if you're into this kind of disturbing movie niche subculture like I am. So without further ado, let's just get this thing started. Again, 5 titles, no random, all completely random, no real order to this at all. So let's just get this started. Starting off with this kind of selection of films is the Jim Van Beber film from 2003, The Manson Family. This film went into production in the 1980s and wasn't finished until the early 2000s when finally a company came along and helped Jim Van Beber finish the film. This is essentially what I would call the quintessential Manson Family film because it isn't some serious drama about the Manson family committing these murders. It wasn't some made-for-TV movie like the early 2000s film about the murders, Helter Skelter. It wasn't the documentary film Helter Skelter. It was its own thing entirely. It was a film about the Manson family. And if there's one thing I've got to give this film credit for, it is legitimately an uncomfortable and unnerving and definitely fucked up film, while it also does portray the Manson family in a way that makes more sense than portraying them as satanic hippies, because they weren't really like satanic hippies. They were a bunch of weirdos who were into LSD who happened to join a murder cult. That's what they did. And, you know, a lot of people like to treat the members of the Manson family and Manson himself as if they were demons from another dimension and they were unstoppable and unkillable, when in reality they were human beings all along. And that's what this film does. It portrays them as exactly that. It portrays them as human beings. They committed inhuman acts, yes, but this portrays them as the fairly mortal weirdos that the family was, and that's something I have to give this film credit for. This film is very interesting in how it's put together, because it's told in this, I want to say, almost like non-chronological, surrealist way that makes the film wholly unique. And I think if anybody said if anybody were to say something about this film, if anybody said anything about this film that I would think that I would have to agree with entirely, it's what I would have to agree with is what Roger Ebert had to say about this film, which is there's no other film quite like The Manson Family. this film falls under its own category. There's no film quite like it. It's part drama, it's part dark comedy, it's part horror, it's part thriller, it's part mystery. It's a little bit of everything, and it is a wholly unique film. And that's exactly what this film is. It's a very unique film, and a unique take on the Manson murders that is also, for the most part, pretty accurate to the actual events. I don't really think I need to explain anymore as to why this film might be considered to be unnerving, uncomfortable, or disturbing. I mean, it is about an actual series of mass murders that were committed. So I'm gonna go ahead and just skip on to the next movie, which is something that's a little easier to talk about. Now, there were a ton of movies in the 90s in Japan that came out. Films like Osaka Telephone Club, Eating Schoolgirls, Guinea Pig, Tumbling Doll Flesh, The Red Room, that came out that were low budget, maybe even semi-erotic Japanese gore films. Here we have one that I haven't seen mentioned as often as the film's kind of semi-sequel. This is from the same director, after all. The film's kind of I think it might have been prequel, actually. But, you know, the sister film to this one, I'm talking about Women's Flesh, My Red Guts. This is essentially just a 40-minute long, kind of surrealist, short, semi-erotic gore film about a woman who starts to mutilate herself horrifically, and it gets pretty graphic at times. This is from the same guy this is a film directed by the same guy who did Tumbling Doll Flesh, which is the sister film to this one that is definitely more well known among the disturbing film community. But I personally think Women's Flesh, My Red Guts is actually a little bit more uncomfortable, the film, because it has a style that isn't trying to pass itself off as like legit snuff. This is a film that knows that it is a kind of semi-surreal, semi-artistic gore porn film, and it doesn't take any shame in that, and it doesn't try to be anything else. And that's something I've gotta say about the film, is that it definitely knows what it is. That being said, it's a pretty violent, uncomfortable little film that if you are squeamish, or if things like self-mutilation disturb you, as it does a lot of people, this is not a film for really anybody in particular. But this is definitely not a film for people who are easily upset and bothered by themes of self-harm and self-mutilation. That's it. Let's get to the next one. This video is falling apart by the fucking millisecond. Next, we have really one of the only Joe D'Amato films that is actually a competent film, and not just a fun cheese fest. For example, I really enjoy Absurd and Anthropophagus. I enjoy both of those movies quite a bit, but both of those movies are fairly kind of cheesy gore fests that, while they do take themselves a little too seriously, they're still cheesy, and the gore is definitely hasn't aged very well, despite me liking both of those movies, mind you. Joe D'Amato is most well known for doing a lot of low-budget gore and horror, schlock, sexploitation films, but if there's one movie among his entire filmography that I would say is actually a very good movie and is actually, like, legitimately shocking, and I think holds up as a pretty stomach-churning, sleazy, gut-wrenching film to this day, it's Beyond the Darkness. This is a film that Joe D'Amato did in the late 70s about a guy who was a taxidermist, and his wife, his fiancée, ends up dying, and he steals her corpse from the graveyard and essentially does taxidermy with it and stuffs his fucking dead fiance's corpse and attempts to keep it with him like a doll. The gore in this film is honestly some of the most realistic gore I've seen in any low-budget Italian horror picture, and that's really saying something. There was actually a rumor that was floating around for quite a while after this film came out that Joe D'Amato used a real corpse for this film, specifically for the embalming and taxidermy scene where the main character turns his fiancée into a doll by embalming her corpse and removing all the intestines and everything. And again, I will say it, the gore in this film is legitimately uncomfortable and stomach-churning and gross and icky. And it also has these interesting psychosexual themes with his kind of housemaid almost having this kind of Oedipus complex, but with his old nanny who took care of him when he was a kid. And she comforts him after the death of his fiancée, and it's weird and gross. And when she finds out that he has dug up this corpse and embalmed it, and when she finds out about him having killed somebody who saw him embalming this corpse, she helps him in dismembering the corpse and dissolve it and destroying it in a bathtub full of sulfuric acid, which again is a very, very grisly, gross scene. Beyond the Darkness is quite a fucked up little film, and I think it holds up pretty well today as a fucking very interesting, gross kind of art house splatter, shocksploitation, psychological horror picture. It holds up very well today. And that's one thing that is kind of hard to say about some 70s and 80s Italian horror, because sometimes it doesn't age very well, and sometimes it ages horribly, and it's just cheesy and stupid. But Beyond the Darkness has actually aged pretty well, I think. Now we're getting into the stuff that is these last two actually that I'm going to talk about are actually a couple titles that I would say are almost impossible to recommend even to people who are trying to get into extreme horror. I would honestly argue some of these are definitely for more people who are seasoned in low budget, zero budget kind of semi-schlocky maybe. Just this is something that is definitely more for the people who are really, really into the sick, disgusting cinema. This isn't something that I would recommend to somebody who is very entry level into the genre. Specifically, the title I'm going to talk about after this, but this one is one I would not recommend to anybody who is used to more mainstream, or at least more semi-well-made production-wise movies. I'm talking about essentially the films of James Bell. For those of you who don't know about James Bell, he's an independent filmmaker from Michigan, I believe, or at least that's where he is located currently. I think, I could be wrong, but James Bell is essentially a low-budget kind of cult art house splatter filmmaker who has been making quite a few waves in the underground horror scene in the past few years, most specifically with his film Tantrum, which I consider to be one of his best, as well as one of his recent films, Nutsack. I'm gonna go ahead and say that just about any James Bell film could be considered for this video, for this part on the video. So that's why I'm saying his entire filmography, specifically his films Dog Dick, Nutsack, Tantrum 2, and Nutsack Part 1, Lucifer's Cosmonauts. Those ones specifically are very, very gross, low-budget, unnerving, atmospheric, kind of just gross-out splatter, gore, horror. It's very hard to explain his movies because they don't really have much in the way of traditional plot, and that's kind of the charm of them. They're very much a watch the trailer for this and you'll definitely know whether or not this might be something you're into, or might be something you're gonna be a fan of, or gonna at least think this might be worth a shot. But yeah, really any James Bell film could go in this section. So I'm going to just go ahead and say Tantrum, which is a surrealist splatter film about a serial killer who commits suicide and ends up in a hellish landscape where he's confronted with his own personal demons as well as his own nightmares and fantasies he faced in his life. And this involves all kinds of crazy shit like castration and corpse fucking. Yeah, James Bell's films are not for the squeamish, but they're definitely very interesting films in their own right. Now, this last one is the one I was talking about when I said this is one I don't think I could really recommend it to just about to any person in particular. I'm talking about the short, 40-minute long anime film from 1992, Shoujo Tsubaki, also known as Midoriya, I believe is the alternate title. This is apparently a short anime film based on a manga that I haven't read, I don't know anything about, and apparently they've even made a live action adaptation of it, which I have not seen yet. But essentially the story of this monstrosity, I should say, is a young girl is essentially abandoned by her parents, and she ends up living with a traveling kind of freak show carnival. And when she shows up there, the freaks take a liking to her and proceed to rape and abuse her and use her essentially as slave labor, and in return they give her a little bit of food and a place to sleep at night. These freaks, these deformed people who are essentially now her guardians as well as her abusers, are so obsessed with making her miserable that when they find out she has made it a habit of stopping by this house where a bunch of puppies happen to live. I think it might have been like somebody's house. It's been a while. I haven't watched this one since October, but they make it a point to make her completely miserable. And when they find out that she's got even the slightest little sliver of happiness in her life, for example, some puppies that she visits every day and plays with for a little bit, after they find out that she has this little bit of happiness in her life, they find the puppies, they kill the puppies, and stomp them to death, and then cook them in a soup and force her to eat it. This is beyond fucked up, and essentially her life continues to be this cycle of rape and torture and abuse until she meets a dwarf magician who suddenly shows up wanting to become part of this traveling freak show carnival. And he falls in love with her, and he promises to take her away and promises her a better life. And this just goes downhill pretty fucking quickly. Like I said, this is a fucking short anime film about a young girl who I think her character is like 12 or 13 years old, who is sexually assaulted and abused by freaks in a freak show. I think I've made it clear enough as to why that this is something that I would not recommend to anybody. But in some weird way, I couldn't stop watching it when I first watched it, and I found it to be very interesting. I don't think I'll ever watch it again, though, because it was such an uncomfortable and disgusting film, honestly. The guy who directed it only directed one other film, and it was another 30-minute long short anime film that had to do with pollution and bullying and like a nuclear war, which that one was pretty interesting as well, that one being titled Death's Lullaby. But yeah, Shoujo Tsubaki, also known as Midoriya, this film is actually on YouTube currently, restored. It's apparently a restored version of it in 1080p that's on YouTube. So that's something that you can actually watch right now if you really want to subject yourself to it, but I would not recommend it at all. Anyway, guys, that is actually it for this one. I'm sorry if this one was a little bit uninteresting. I'm sorry if I tripped over my words and sounded like an idiot for most of it. It's just a bad habit. I like to do these things completely improv off the top of my head. And in doing so, I fuck up a lot of things because I don't want to write a script, because it's hard for me to write a script and have it in front of me because I hate having to look down and read it and look back up at the camera. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm sorry that my video quality is so shit most of the time. But anyway, guys, if you made it to the end of this video, I really do appreciate it. I appreciate any support, any views, anything like that. I always do. And I always try to get back to any comments anybody leaves on my videos. But this is Biscuit Boo, Horror Reviews, signing off. Peace.